Hi everybody, welcome back. I hope that you're doing well and that you're reading something that you like, something you enjoy. Remember, this is not a contest, but we're starting a new book here, and the book that we're doing, we're going to do a few videos on this one, kind of like we did last time. The book that we're doing is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Don't know if you've read this. If you haven't read it, you really should. And if we're lucky, by the time I'm done with all of these, you will be convinced that this is a book that you need to have on your shelves. We'll start with the question that we always start with, which is, why this book? And again, this one's kind of a little bit of a cheat, which is I teach this book, so I've gone through it a couple times by myself with my students, and so I feel like I know it well enough to start doing some of these, especially early videos on my YouTube channel where I can talk about things I'm reasonably confident in, and maybe even come up with some good ideas to bring to the classroom when I get back to them. So, what makes this book interesting? Well, the first thing is that it is time travel. I really like time travel. I have a very soft spot in my heart for time travel books, and this is one that I hadn't read before, and it is interesting and unusual amongst time travel books in that there is no real well understood mechanism for how the time travel happens. The narrator simply goes back in time and travels 3,000 miles of space. We kind of know what triggers it as we get through it, but we don't know why it happens. We don't know if anyone's responsible for it. Is this a force of nature? Is this somebody trying to teach her a lesson or close a time loop or something like that? We have no idea. But what being this sort of involuntary time travel does is it allows Butler to do something which, from my reading up on her, she kind of really enjoys doing, which is taking a protagonist and putting them really on their back foot, putting them in a position where they have to make some difficult decisions, where they are not really prepared for what they get into, and they have to figure out how to make that work for them. And in this case, the main character, who is Dana Franklin, is a black woman living in 1976 who gets herself time traveled to antebellum Maryland in the early 1800s. And if you are a student of American history, hopefully you know that the early 1800s is not a good place to be a black woman, especially in Maryland. So this lack of control, this lack of I don't know, agency, Dana's unable to control when she travels back in time, well, sort of. She certainly is not in control of herself and her own autonomy when she gets back to antebellum Maryland. So it really gives Butler a chance to show a character who has to think fast, who has to make some very hard decisions in order to survive, in order to get through this, and in order to sort of do what she needs to do with these time trips. The other thing that it allows Butler to do is to look back on history. She did a lot of reading about slave narratives before she wrote this, because she knew, what she was trying to do. And it's very clear that she didn't want slavery to be, if you pardon the pun, whitewashed. She was an African-American woman herself. She had seen sort of her mother, living in the mid-20th century. And I had read some interviews with Octavia Butler where she had seen her mother basically, I don't know if humiliate herself is the right word, but kind of live in imposed humility. Would that work? Yeah. And Butler kind of wanted to know, why don't you just, shake it off? Why don't you rise up and do the things that, insist on the equality that you deserve? And I think that she, like a lot of people, didn't really understand sort of the impact that being an enslaved population had on not only the generations that were enslaved, but the ones that came after them. And so I think she really wanted to explore that. She wanted to show slavery in a very real terms and in very real senses, and not try to make it kind of cartoony or sanitized or anything like that. She wanted to examine how easy it is to become a slave, and how, and also maybe to punch some holes in the idea of the good slave owner. I know today we've heard plenty about that. There are Southern apologists in the U.S. who will say, okay, well, yes, slavery was bad, but some of the slave owners were good, right? They gave their people homes and food and clothes, and it would have been worse in a different plantation. And all of that may be true, but owning another human being as property is not good. It is bad. It was bad. It has always been bad. And so I think she wanted to kind of examine, to a sense, like, what does it mean to be a slave holder, and what kind of person does that, living in that context, turn you into as a white person who owns slaves. Which gets to, again, this idea of morality and judging people. And again, today we look back on the antebellum time, the time of slavery in the U.S., and we make some pretty harsh judgments about slavery and being a slave owner. And we, I hope, unless you're watching this somewhere in some of the southern U.S. states, in which case YouTube may be forced to kind of delete this video at some point, because I think slavery, and I'm going to take a real strong position here, and I know that's dangerous on YouTube to take real strong positions, but I'm going to come right out and say it. Slavery was bad. Full stop. Full stop. No buts, no unlesses. There we go. All right? Go ahead, haters, hate. But I think we still look back on those times and we judge people by a very distant morality. We look at the behaviors of people who lived during the times of slavery, and I think a lot of us say, well, if I were there, I would have done things differently, right? If I, being a white guy, were growing up in that time period, I like to believe that I would look at slavery and say, oh, no, this is wrong. I can't be part of this. Would I have, though? Would I have had that in my head? Would I have been given that idea? Where would that idea have come from for me? I don't know. Maybe. And in the case of this book, that idea kind of comes from a visitor from your long descendant, and it doesn't actually work. But I think, yeah, looking at morality from a distance is really interesting, and what would happen if you were forced to engage with those things about which, from our 21st century perspective, we can take a fairly safe stance on, because I'm not going to be a slave owner. I have no way of being a slave owner. That cannot happen. So I can take whatever stance I want, but if I were to be time traveled back to, 1820 Maryland, I might have to make some tough decisions as well, because that's not the prevailing mindset. And that's not to say there weren't anti-slavery people there. That's not to say there weren't people making a moral case against slavery. There absolutely were in that time. But in that time and in that place, it was a lot riskier to do than it is now, where I can get on YouTube and say slavery is wrong. Done. So we can do our bit about judging past morality by present standards. We have some very complex characters in that result, because that's what the main character Dana has to do. She has to take her 1979, I may have said 76. No, it was written in 79, it takes place in 76. She has to take her 1976 morality and understanding of what's right and wrong, and has to kind of bend so as not to stand out, because standing out in that time for her, again, a black woman, means beating and possibly death. And it's important to remember that Dana grew up in a time much, much better for her than for her ancestors. So she said, at several times in the book, she asks herself why she stops trying to do what she thinks is the right thing. And largely it's because she knows that punishment will come if she does. So Dana herself is a fairly complicated character who has to make a lot of really scary decisions in a short amount of time. We also have Rufus, who is her ancestor, and we get to see him grow up because of this time dilation effect that Butler has chosen to use. And we'll get into that a little bit in another video, but basically much less time passes in 1976 for Dana than it does in the 1800s when she's there. So it's not a one-to-one parallel. But one of the things that allows us to do, and it allowed Butler to do, is explore Rufus growing up. And we get to kind of see if he will grow up to be a decent person or a slave owner like his father. And his father himself is fascinating because he is the owner of this plantation. He owns all these human beings, which again, we've already agreed is wrong and bad. And yet he behaves in ways that he believes is honorable. He behaves in ways that he believes are right and just. So again, it's complicated. He's not a monster. And we can ask ourselves and talk to ourselves about why Tom Whalen's not a monster. So yeah, we've got these moral quandaries. We've got interesting characters. We've got time travel. Hooray! So yeah, a basic rundown of the plot is we've got Dana, who is a black woman living in 1976. She is living with her white husband, and I think in my research I found that this is, I believe, the first interracial couple in, I want to say, science fiction, if not American literature at the time. But yeah, Butler took a nice chance, and it works out well because it's very useful for her plot of having an interracial marriage. But anyway, Dana finds that she is pulled back to 18 something. She lives in 1976 California whenever her ancestor Rufus is in danger, and she gets pulled back to save him. So she's there when he is a very young child, almost drowning in a river. She's there when he's a little older, about to set his house on fire. She's there when he is getting into a fight and getting his butt kicked. So she keeps getting pulled back to save him. But the only way for her to return to 76 is for her to feel in danger of her life. So there are her periods where she stays in the South, or in the past, I should say, become longer and longer and longer and longer and longer, and she has to learn how to adapt to live there. At one point, she accidentally brings her husband along with her. That's fun. But yeah, all this time, she has to figure out how to stay alive and how to keep Rufus alive, because he has to father her great-great-something grandmother. And trying to deal with what Rufus wants from her, what everybody else wants from her, and what she wants from herself, all the while keeping a low enough profile that she doesn't get beaten, and all the while keeping her own sense of self that she doesn't feel like she has become a slave. It is a complicated thing, but it's very, very good. And so hopefully in this overall series of videos, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the time travel and the morality of things, the complicated characters. I want to, again, kind of talk about the framing device of this book. It starts off at the end, after her time travel's finished, and why did Octavia Butler do that? We can maybe talk about that as well. We can talk about the Rufus-Dana relationship and what that is like and how kind of weird and unsettling it might be. And of course, why use time travel as a conceit? What is it that drew Butler maybe to the use of time travel in order to do this, other than her deep-seated love of science fiction? It may be because for her there was no really other option. Of course it's going to be time travel, because why not? We're going to get into it. We're going to talk a lot about it. I hope that you enjoy it. If you haven't read it, I hope you do. If you have read it, I hope that you can pop in some ideas down in the comments and tell me what you think and what your thoughts are, and of course what I might have missed. I'm only one guy doing this in his part-time off the dome. So anything that you think I have dropped, you can help me pick up, and I'll be happy to do that. So stick with me, and we will see you next time.